Let me now introduce tonight's speaker, Carolyn Porter. Carolyn Porter is a graphic designer. She's also a type designer, and she's a writer. And her first font, Marcel script with P22 Type Foundry. And I'm assuming we're going to hear a little bit about that tonight, maybe. It won 5 awards, including the prestigious Certificate for Typographic Excellence from the New York Type Directors Club. And her book, Marcel's Letters, which we also better hear about tonight, won numerous book awards as well. And Carolyn lives in Minnesota with her husband and their 110-pound black lab. That's a big dog. So I asked Carolyn to tell me something interesting about herself as part of the introduction, and she said that she and her husband, Aaron, who's in the back there selling books, are determined to outlive each other. Why, you ask? He says he has to outlive her so he can put her least favorite typeface on her tombstone so that he can laugh about it for all eternity. Mwahaha. She is, as you might imagine, determined to outlive him, so he can't do that. And we could speculate here about the, shall we say, interesting nature of their relationship. Have they tried marriage counseling? Type counseling? Is that a thing? But the real burning question is, which typeface are they talking about? Papyrus? Helvetica? Helvetica now? Once we know that crucial detail, it will be clear which one we give the thumbs up to and which one gets the thumbs down. So without further ado, I present Carolyn Porter. Welcome.
Thank you. So thank you to the San Francisco Public Library. Thank you to Letterform Archive. I spent the morning there, and it was just extraordinary. I was looking at handwritten books from the 1400s and trying not to drool on the pages. They were just so extraordinarily beautiful. I want to give a shout out to a friend and an author friend who is here tonight. Elizabeth raised her hand. Elizabeth Reineke spent decades trying to track down missing paintings of her great-grandfather who worked in Poland during the interwar years. And if you have an interest in World War II history, the mystery of missing artwork, or the story of a San Francisco-based writer, I encourage you to check out her book or documentary film. It's called Chasing Portraits. So that's my little shout out. So thank you for coming. Before I can tell you Marcel's story, I have to tell you the story behind the story, because it's the only way that the story of Marcel's letters will make sense. I'm a graphic designer, and one thing someone studies when they prepare to become a graphic designer is typography. And so when I was in school, we studied the proportion, shapes, styles, and characters of letters. We learned about different kinds of old type, wood type, and metal type. We learned about type designers who were then, the only people we talked about were long dead European men. The last names might be familiar: Bodoni, Guillemond, Caslin. We studied classes of type, serif and sans serif. We studied parts of letters, which have anatomic-like labels. Letters have legs and arms, hairlines, spines, shoulders, ears, eyes. Some letters even have crotches. As I began my design career, I used type, but it never crossed my mind to design type. At that point, computers were new. I had no idea the font design software even existed, and I had no idea people were designing new fonts. But even before taking the classes in college, I had a love of handwriting. And Ever since I was a kid, it seemed like handwriting provided a glimpse into the soul of the writer. And over time, I've grown to have a specific love of old handwriting. So for years, I've collected handwriting specimens. And I really love handwriting from about 1880 to 1910. It is just this, it has this sweet spot of this blend of restraint and flourish that I just find really magical. So not all of the specimens that I even collect are in English, but that's okay, because to me these specimens are eye candy. And I admit, this is a very impractical thing to collect. That purple USA is on an envelope. The L's in Lyon, that was a 1920s French grammar school classroom workbook. W. Allen, I imagine him having like a really ruffly shirt. The H's are also from a French grammar school class workbook. So a few years after I graduated from college, I was living in Texas, and I learned about this man. His name is Thomas Jefferson Rusk, and he was one of the first two senators from what was then the brand new state of Texas. And some of Rusk's letters are in the archive at the University of Texas at Austin, and these letters caught the eye of a graphic designer named Brian Wilson. So Brian used these letters to design what was then the very first font that mimicked the look of old-timey handwriting. The font is called Texas Hero. And I love the way these letters just seem to scratch and dance across the page. And when I saw this, it was a real eureka moment for me. It combined multiple interests, that being this old-timey handwriting that I had loved for years, typography, which I had studied, what was then the brand new font design software, and Brian was a graphic designer, which sort of gave me permission to also design a font. So my reaction was an unequivocal, I'm gonna do that someday. I'm gonna design a font based on old handwriting. So Brian was the first, but other designers have designed fonts based on old handwriting. Here are a few. Anybody know who Timothy Matlock is? Anybody? It's his handwriting that we see on the Declaration of Independence. There are actually 3 different fonts based on the handwriting of Abraham Lincoln. So even though others had done this, I still intended to design a font. But what I needed to do was to find a handwriting sample that was different than any font that had been designed so far. So for years, I looked for my specimen. I looked in antique stores, on eBay, I looked at the writing of older relatives, but nothing was quite right. Or if you think of that beautiful USA, it was a limited character set, and I needed to find a complete sample, something that had A to Z uppercase, A to Z lowercase, and numbers. So one day I was in Stillwater, Minnesota, which is a cute little riverfront town not far from my home, and the little town is filled with antique stores and restaurants. And I saw these letters. They had the beautiful, scratchy handwriting that I had been looking for. The letters were readable, even though I couldn't read them. They were written in French. I really loved that letter M that you see going through the blue stripe. And I was really excited because there were a bunch of letters there which gave me enough to work with. That is, between all the letters, I could cobble together A to Z lowercase, A to Z uppercase, and numbers. So I knew right then and there, as I stood in the store, these letters were gonna be the basis for my font. So there were 20 or so letters in the store, and I tried to pick 4, because that's what budget allowed. I could see the letters were from 1943, 1944. I could see the Hitler stamps, which placed them viscerally during World War II. I could see they had been mailed from Berlin to a place called Bercher-la-Mangois in France. I could see all the letters were signed by a man named Marcel. I couldn't help but to wonder if they might be love letters. But ultimately, it didn't matter. An A in French looks like an A in English, and that's all I cared about. I ended up buying 4 letters and a postcard. The handwriting on the postcard, which you see here, the handwriting isn't exceptional. But as I stood in the store, I thought about Thomas Jefferson Rusk, the senator from Texas, and the fact that Brian Wilson, the graphic designer who designed the font, had information about who had written the letter. So I thought it might ultimately be interesting to know who had written these letters, and the postcard had the last name and an address. So knowing what I know now, you would have thought I would have raced home and had the letters translated, but I didn't. It's not that I didn't care what was in the letters, I didn't really think about it, because all I cared about was to work on the font. So the first step was to scan in the letters super, super high resolution, and after I did that, I put the original letters away for safekeeping. I traced my favorite letters, favorite individual letters, ultimately outlined them in Illustrator, refine them in FontLab, which is font design software, and then this is the final M. So here you can see the original handwriting on the top and the font below. There are some differences. I had to make some decisions about standardization of size and angle. You can see, for example, the original P swoops down, which is a very European way of writing a P, but instead I had the P swoop in because I figured there are enough people that have a hard time reading cursive anyway. I wanted to do what I could to make it very readable and recognizable. Here's the basic character set. And the Pro version of the font has more than 1,300 alternate characters, which begins to help mimic the look of handwriting, but it's ultimately impossible for a font to include the infinite variability that comes with handwriting. There's a type designer in the front row here nodding his head. Yep. If you zoom way in on the letters, the letters still retain that rough, scratchy character of original ink on paper handwriting. And here's one sample. You can see the Y's and dreary and weary are different. Here, the 4 I's in Mississippi are all different. That one I just did because I thought it would be fun. The 2 R's in recipe and raspberry are different. Super and secret, those S's are different. So the font was released in 2014, which represents 12 years of work on the font, evenings and weekends. I had a full-time job, so this was only ever a side project. And at the time, I didn't know any other type designers. I didn't have anyone to go to for help. And the process was really trial and error and error and error. But I never gave up. So that's the backstory. Excuse me just one second. So you needed to know the backstory, because otherwise it wouldn't make any sense why a graphic designer from White Bear Lake, Minnesota would have any interest in old letters they couldn't even read. In 2011, which was 9 years after I bought the letters, I took the letters out of the closet where they had been stored since the time I scanned them and then put them away for safekeeping. And I was reminded of how beautiful the letters were. So if you think of, while I was working on the font, I usually had one character at a time on my screen, really big in black and white. So I had forgotten that the paper itself was yellowed. I had forgotten that the edge of the paper was ruffled like a feather. I had forgotten that the inks were blue and gray and brown. I had forgotten about the Hitler stamps. And I had forgotten that you can just look at the letters, and even if you can't read them, you can see this inherent sense of sentimentality. So I realized I knew Marcel's handwriting intimately. I knew every curve and nick of every single letter, but I realized I didn't know anything about him. So out of curiosity, I decided to have one letter translated. I thought, I'll find out who Marcel was, and I'll find out why he had been writing from Berlin during the depths of World War II, and I figured that would be it. So this is the first letter I had translated, and it's the only letter that I'm going to read in its entirety. And if you know French, feel free to read along. March 21st, 1943, Sunday at 3 o'clock. You can tell Mom that today I'm eating the last of the beans and that she can send some more. Love and kisses from Papa to everyone. My dear little girls, today it's springtime and the weather is excellent. This afternoon, Moutardier should come to see me, so while waiting for him, I'll reply to your very kind letter, which pleased me very much. Before writing to you, I did my laundry. Once it's dry, I will have quite a bit of mending to do. It would be great to have one of you two with me. So I see you had a good time at Mardi Gras. I hope you didn't scare Lily or little Jacqueline. In the meantime, you should go pick violets in the nearby woods. This morning I had some bad luck. While combing my hair, my comb broke in my hand. You can tell Mom that she can send me another one. Denise, I would like to receive a letter from you so you can tell me what you did in Montreux. Did you go to the movies with Mom? Did you go shopping by yourself? And what about you, Suzanne? Were you the one getting milk and bread while Mom was in Paris? As for Lily, I'm glad she's no longer sucking her thumb. I recommend that she doesn't pick the blossoms from the cherry tree or the pear trees. She should wait until the fruit is ripe. My dear little ones, I don't have much else to tell you today. I recommend that you be on your best behavior. Please give my love to your mother. Hug her a lot, and the same for Grandma too. Your Papa who sends his love from 1,300 kilometers away. Signed, your Papa who thinks about you all the time. So that was interesting. It was a love letter, no, though not the kind of love letter I had expected. And it was confusing, because he didn't sound like a soldier. A soldier shouldn't have to buy his own beans. And he didn't sound like a businessman, because a businessman should be able to go buy his own comb. So I was confused but intrigued. And it was ultimately, I was just left with this sense of sweetness, and his daughters, I learned, were 9, 7, and 4. So I thought, I'm going to search for information on Marcel Heuzé. I'm good at finding things online. I do a lot of research for my clients, so I presumed I could just Google his name and easy as that, get some answers. But I didn't find anything. But what I did run across were all these names and places that I didn't understand. I'm not a historian. I hadn't had a history class since high school. And I couldn't remember much of anything about French World War II history. So as I waited to have the second letter translated, I realized I needed a history refresher, so that's what I'm going to give you. So September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. France and Britain were allies of Poland, which is why they in turn declared war on Germany. The winter of 1939-1940, Germany and France had a standoff along their shared border. The sense was that Germany was never going to invade, which is why it was called the phony war. But May 1940, Germany invades. The French and British forces retreat. They made their way to the coastline, and they were evacuated at Dunkirk, if you saw the movie. 2 million French soldiers were taken prisoner of war, which is something they don't really talk about in the movie. May 1940, the Germans head to Paris. Parisians fled by the millions. The feeling was that it was safer to be anywhere than to be in Paris, and people left by any means possible. There were even reports of people pushing elderly relatives in wheelbarrows so they weren't left behind. June 14th, 1940, the Germans enter Paris. June 24th, 1940, France surrenders. It was a staggering reshuffling of alliance. An armistice was signed, and I'm going to read one sentence from the armistice. Quote, the French government will immediately direct all officials to comply with the regulations of and to collaborate fully with the German military authorities. France was divided into occupied and unoccupied zones. By the end of the war, the entire country was occupied. Life was difficult under German rule. Resources were plundered. Trains were loaded with pigs and horses and grapes. food and fuel was rationed. Some things, such as chicken and soap, were just unavailable. The resistance was active and dangerous, and it grew more so as the war went on. In October 1940, the Vichy government began to impose anti-Semitic laws on French Jews. In 1942, they began to deport Jews. 75,000 French Jews were deported. Less than 2,000 survived. So from the first letter, it didn't seem like Marcel was a POW or a businessman, so I had to begin to wonder if he was Jewish. And ultimately, I learned there were more French civilians killed during the war than French military. June 6, 1944, the D-Day landings, and what soldiers found was a country left in ruins. August 25th, 1944, Paris was liberated. January 1945, the Germans were completely out of France. May 8th, 1945 was VE Day. So all of that information was good and interesting, but it didn't tell me why Marcel was in Berlin, and it didn't tell me what happened to him. So up until that point, the translation and the search for information, it was just a curiosity, just something I was doing for fun. But once I got the translation of the second letter, everything changed. He was no longer just a resource for my silly font project. He was no longer just a man who was writing sweet words to his 3 daughters. He was a man trying to survive. So this letter was written to his wife, not his daughters. The tone was different, and I'm just gonna read a couple of excerpts. Sunday the 12th, my darling, today, Sunday, it's 1:30, and I'm in the barracks with Marcel, Mamille, and Bernard. The weather is terrible. 1 minute, some beautiful sun that invites us to go for a walk, but a few minutes later, it starts snowing. Mamille is in the corner by the fire like an old grandfather, and he sings to us the Song of the Mason by Maurice Chevalier. Today is the 12th, exactly 14 months since I started working at Daimler. For the past week, we've been living the good life. I should explain a little bit. In the square, there's a guy from Amiens who has tricks to get food. You can imagine how we are 3 big mouths, Mamille, Marcel, and me, when we are served. It's the wallet that finds this the funniest, because a 1,000 bill represents a little more than a kilo of bread. Yesterday, we ate a kilo of cake, which was worth much more than a simple crepe with blackberry jam. It fills the stomach all the same. Speaking of crepes, I decided to make some since a friend gave me flour. There you go, just a little flour and water with nothing to cook them with. Funny-looking crepes. I also have to tell you how I got a work suit yesterday. The work office gave them to us. It's made in Poland. All the French will be wearing the same thing, just like the Russians who got them, so now we won't be able to tell each other apart. This is the first Sunday I'm spending in the square because up until now I was working on Sundays. So this morning I took advantage of it. I got up at 9. I started to read a nice book, but it got me dizzy because it was only talking about eating and beautiful women, all the things that are not allowed. And he ends the letter, my little treasure, I will end my letter due to lack of space. Kiss my little daughters for me as well as our dear mother, your big guy who loves you with all his heart and sends you his best love and kisses, signed Marcel. So what did we learn from that letter? We learned 5 things. He was writing from a barrack. He worked for Daimler. There were Russians at the camp. He was hungry and had tricks to get food. And he was writing from a place called Marion, Felda. And if you add those 5 things together, there's only one possible answer. And that is that Marcel was at the Daimler Marion Felda factory making Panther tanks for the Germans. So it took a while to wrap my head around the reality of that situation, and that Marcel was forced to build tanks that would be used against those trying to liberate his country and his family. But why? Why would a Frenchman be in Berlin making Panther tanks for the Germans? For weeks, I looked for information and answers to that question, and I ultimately stumbled over a 3-letter acronym, STO, that explained why Marcel had been in Germany. So in mid-1942, which was 2 years after Germany invaded France, the Germans demanded 250,000 French workers. And those workers would be sent to Germany to fill jobs in factories, farms, and mines that had been done by German men. But if you think about it, the German men were on the Eastern or the Western fronts fighting, and there were all these jobs that still had to be done. So the Vichy government originally asked for volunteers. Radio broadcasts promised favorable wages, comfortable living conditions, and a big incentive was that the Germans agreed to release one French prisoner of war for every 3 volunteers. So I'm going to show you a photo that you've already seen. The sign on the far right-hand side says German Employment Office. So some examples of some propaganda posters. This one says, "Every hour of work in Germany is a stone brought to the rampart that protects France. To defend your life, which weapon do you choose, the bandit's machine gun or the worker's tool? They give their blood. Give your work to save Europe from Bolshevism. You have the keys to the camp. You release prisoners by working in Germany." If you ever rewatch Saving Private Ryan, this poster is used as set dressing in one of the scenes near the beginning of the movie. This one says, "You will be the ambassador of French quality." This one says, "Come to us, you will be well received, you will make money." And small text at the bottom promises that the Germans will take care of you after your departure. And this one, which I find the most ridiculous of them all, says, "German workers invite you to join them." And this German blonde, of course, looks so carefree, so downright giddy, that if the Sledgehammer had been a golf club, this would have been a perfect advertisement for a country club. So many of the first French volunteers were from the fringes of society, criminals who chose Germany over prison, the idle who had been rounded up at cinemas, cafes, or racetracks, or foreigners living in France. But when the number of volunteers filled less than half the quota, the Vichy government needed a different strategy, so the pretense of voluntary recruitment was abandoned, and a new law called Surveille du Travail Obligatoire, or STO, was passed. And under that law, any man between the age of 18 and 50, and any single woman between the age of 21 and 35 was subject to, quote, "carry out all work that the government deems appropriate in the best interest of the nation." And to be very clear, the best interest of the nation was not talking about France, but of Germany. And the STO was the first thing that made any sense. It explained why 4 months after that law passed, Marcel might have been in Berlin. It explained why he sounded like neither a soldier nor a businessman, why he referenced barracks and his status as a prisoner, why he might ask for beans and a comb, and it seemed to be the only explanation for why he had been so far from the people that he loved. But think of what that meant. Almost anyone, regardless of religion or political affiliation, could be forced to work for the Nazis, to work for the enemy. By the end of the war, 650,000 French civilians would be deported to Germany. Tens of thousands would never return. And if all of that isn't bad enough, my husband, who's ex-Army, pointed out a very sobering reality, which was, what would the US want to bomb more than a factory making tanks? So in addition to working for the enemy, men like Marcel had to face the reality that the factory where they worked was a high-value military target, and workers were collateral damage. I began an intense search for Marcel. He has a very unusual last name, so I thought it would be easy. And ultimately, after weeks and weeks of searching, I found a Frenchman named Marcel Heuzé, who had been killed at the Ravensbrück concentration camp in April 1945, 4 days before the camp was liberated. Ravensbrück was 50 miles from Berlin, and I realized close meant convenient. And I was surprised at how sad I was. But I had been looking at his handwriting for 9 years at this point, and I was sad because I was helpless to change anything. Millions of people were killed during World War II, so the rational part of my brain was thinking, well, why not Marcel? Days later, I looked at the same record. I think of it as like getting a diagnosis where it just takes a while to sink in. And it was a very comprehensive registry, but there were no daughters listed for Marcel. So I had no reason to believe that that Frenchman named Marcel Heuzé was the same as my Marcel Heuzé. But if there was any chance that my Marcel lived, I had to know, so I kept on looking. There's the Ravensbrück concentration camp. So I had the third letter translated, and it was encouraging. It was from November 1943, and remarkably, it sounded as though he thought he might be coming home soon, though that was not true, and I knew that because of the dates on other letters. And this letter, it ends with the sweet words of love. Give my little girls big kisses from me, your big boy who sends you the most tender kisses, always looking forward to be able to hold you in his arms. It would take weeks for the letters to get back and forth between Berlin and this tiny little village called Bercher-le-Mangois. Workers like Marcel were not monitored by the Red Cross. The Red Cross tracked POWs, but not civilian workers. So I came to understand that these letters were not just proof of love, they were proof of life. I began writing letters, emails, scouring websites for information, but there was still no sign of any other Marcel. I didn't have a lot to go on. I had his name, I had the first names of his 3 daughters, but I didn't even have his wife's name because he only ever called her my darling. The address in Bercher-le-Mangois seemed temporary. It's a tiny little farming village, and I looked on Google Maps, and the street didn't even seem to exist anymore, the street where he was mailing the postcards. And it was like Marcel had been forgotten by time. So meanwhile, I learned more about the Marion Felda labor camp. It was a true labor camp. Men and women worked 60 to 70 hours per week. They had every other Sunday afternoon off. Buildings were made of brick and stone, surrounded by razor wire and guarded by SS. Prisoners were beaten. They had to stand for long roll calls. Clean water and sanitation were non-existent. They could get a shower once a month. Some workers, the Italians that were in the camp, they had gone to work one day. They were rounded up, put on a train, so the only clothes that they had with them were what they happened to be wearing that day. Frenchmen like Marcel had been given a list of things to bring with, an overcoat, sheets, a change of clothes, heavy boots. But I learned from his letters everything he brought with him was lost in a fire about a week after he arrived. And as the war went on, he would describe the garments that he was wearing, and at one point he was wearing women's clothes. But still, as a Frenchman, he was better off than many others. The Russians, for example, did not have the right to go into a bunker during an air raid, and men like Marcel had the ability to buy additional food on the black market. I also learned more about Daimler. In 1944, half of Daimler-Benz's 63,000 employees were civilian forced laborers, prisoners of war or concentration camp detainees. And according to their website, they even admitted that these workers were housed close to the plants and barracks with poor prison-like conditions. Companies like Daimler claimed they had no choice, but there were cases where Daimler employees handpicked workers they wanted from ghettos, and all unselected workers were sent to death camps. So I reached out to Daimler. I can tell you I did not expect to hear back from Daimler. But I got connected to an archivist in Stuttgart. And he went into Daimler's records and found a handwritten record of Marcel's entry into the camp, and the date corresponded to a date in one of Marcel's letters. And it listed wife plus 3, which meant wife plus 3 children. And I learned he worked as a lathe operator, so he burnished metal, ground and polished metal. The record included a birthday. And so for the first time after many months of searching, I had confirmation this was a different Marcel than the Marcel who had been killed in Ravensbrück. So they didn't have any information in his fate, but I had to keep on looking. So this is the 4th letter. It's a 4-page letter. You're only seeing 1 letter here. This letter I purchased specifically because it included lots of numbers, and I needed numbers for the font. And little could I imagine what detail those numbers revealed. So this letter is from February 1st, 1943. At 6 o'clock, it's the evening meal. He wrote, 6:10, everything is done. We run errands in town or go back to the barracks to get letters and to make food because as soon as we leave the table, we are hungry again. What we eat doesn't stick to our ribs. When I come back, I will make you Fridolin cuisine and you can tell me the news. As for the tough times, let me tell you about a big event the other day. At 7:30 p.m., the sirens go off. We hurry down the shelter, leaving all the just-served plates of food on the tables. At 8:30, the sirens have been blaring for an hour. Then, strangely, even in the shelter, we feel a blast because nearby there's an anti-aircraft artillery battery. At 20 minutes to 9, someone yells that the barracks are burning. Everyone hesitates to go out because the bursts are still going off all around us. Then the battery takes a big hit and everything quiets down. I'm able to go out with a buddy. The moment he opens the shutters to go out through the window panes blow up. The barracks was an inferno. At 9:30, we see the results of the operation. All around us, houses are burning, and so is the battery with 6 Krauts killed off. In our 2 French barracks, 5 Russians and 1 Russian dead. The worst is the prisoners' camp. 80 guys burned alive because the Germans locked them inside the barrack. Talk about some real bastards. Had letter 5, which is the postcard translated, and it's from April 13th, 1944. It's short. The card is really small. There's just not a lot of room to write. He asks his wife about the garden and whether she would be able to help find, if she would be able to find help tilling the ground. He asks about a neighbor, and he inquires about the goat. He talks about a friend in camp. And he ends, "My little treasure, I leave you for today while always keeping the hope I will see you again soon. Give a big kiss to my little hoodlums as well as our dear mother. I send you my biggest kisses, and above all, be careful with your health. Signed, your big guy who only dreams of you." So at this point, I'm feeling both very connected to Marcel. I'm a voyeur on these very private and intimate words, while also being incredibly frustrated by the lack of answers. And there's this battle raging in my head. I wanted him to be reunited with his family, but I also knew it was unlikely. The average lifespan, for example, for a forced laborer for bear was 3.5 months. There was also a battle going on in my head at that time about the font. It still wasn't done at that point. It was in progress. And I wasn't sure if I could finish it. Not legally, but ethically. And it was quite possible that 9 years worth of work was just going to have to be shelved. But I just couldn't see finishing it without knowing what happened. So I became obsessed with finding out what happened. I wrote more letters. Most were unanswered. My mom is into genealogy. She helped look, but she couldn't find anything. And I researched more and more detailed records, and I found myself doing things like reading transcripts of the Nuremberg war crime trials, because I was thinking maybe there is one sentence in here somewhere that says what happened to the French forced laborers. I even scoured military records to see what I could learn about the bombing of Berlin, because I knew the city was devastated. Records that I found included the U.S. Air Force aerial bombing raids of the Daimler Marion Felda factory. So this is the before, during, and after of the bombing of the factory. And here's the factory after the war. The Russians eventually got to the factory. Any machinery that was still workable was sent back to Russia. And ultimately, I did find one record, which is the death of his daughter, Suzanne, the eldest daughter. She had died more than 20 years earlier. And as the war went on, Marcel continued to write. You could feel the increased anxiety. You could see it in his handwriting, too, because his handwriting degraded as the war went on. You could feel his yearning to be with his wife and his daughters, and to do the one thing that he could not do from far away, which was to protect them. For example, in June 1944, he wrote, It enrages me not to be able to be with you. If you see us getting too close to home, don't panic, hide what's the most precious. Do all you can not to go too far away. You know what I used to tell you when we went into the woods. Sometimes it's better to be afraid of the animals for a while in order to save one's skin. According to the newspapers, the fighting is frightening, and the people who are there must be terribly scared, so I don't know what to tell you to help you to hang on. But he signs it, and for you, my beloved one, I always save my most tender kisses. So I learned more about the village of Bercher-le-Mangois, the tiny little farming village in France. The family was originally from Paris, but they lived in Berchard-Lemongrois from 1939 to 1945. So if you think of those photos that I showed you of people exiting Paris, they were part of that. They lived in a 2-room stone building without running water or electricity, but still it was out of Paris, so it was considered safer, largely because they could grow food. And Marcel's wife traded with farm wives in the village, sewing lessons for farming lessons. But there were still times when she and her girls survived on rutabaga and goat's milk. Other times she had to steal food. I came to have the utmost respect for her. She was tenacious and very brave. And I learned late in the summer of 1944, so if you think of the Germans retreating northward back to Germany, they came through the village, and she did have to take her girls and go hide in the woods. It was ultimately coming up on a year of searching for information on his fate, and I was out of ideas. I didn't know who else to write to, and there was still no trace of what happened to him, and it was as if everything but these handwritten letters and the record in the archive at Daimler in Stuttgart, it was as if everything else had been erased from history. And after reading how deeply he loved his wife and daughters, I refused to let that happen. I refused to let him be forgotten. He deserved to be remembered. Everyone deserves to be remembered. So I'm going to read a really short excerpt from the book. I'm going to take a drink of water, and then I'm going to read the short excerpt from the book. A couple of nights later, I saw Marcel. It was not the first time I dreamed about the search, but it was the first time I saw him in a dream. He walked ahead of me on a narrow, gravel-covered country road. The back of his thin frame was in sharp focus. The fields and trees in the periphery were modeled like a painting. He wore old trousers and worn brown shoes. Rolled up threadbare shirt sleeves pooled around bony elbows. Marcel's arms hung at his sides, swinging slightly as he walked. His hands were empty. I watched and waited for Marcel to glance left or right, hoping to see his profile, but he never wavered from his straight-ahead singular focus. I listened for birds or cars, cows or wind, but the only sound that echoed in my ears was the rhythmic crunch of his footsteps. Marcel never broke from his steady pace. Sometimes I lagged behind and had to take running steps to regain my place. Other times I tried walking faster, but no matter what I did, I could not close the distance between us. I tried determining the color of his hair. Was it black, brown, blonde? I could not tell. Colors seemed to shift in the light. Was he tall or short? He was too far ahead to know for sure. I longed for Marcel to turn and extend an invitation for me to join him. I wanted to walk beside him, to hear the timbre of his voice. There were so many questions I wanted to ask, so many things I wanted to know. Somehow, in my dream, we would understand each other. I was certain we would somehow speak a common language. But Marcel never noticed I followed behind, or perhaps he did. Either way, deep down, I knew why he did not turn around. Deep in my bones, I understood. I woke from the dream wrapped in a blanket of sadness, as thick and heavy as the comforter covering me. I lay motionless as I attempted to cement into memory each and every detail. Marcel's gait, his swinging arms, his rolled-up shirt sleeves, his worn brown shoes. I did not have to work hard to interpret what my subconscious understood with absolute certainty. I was never going to catch up with him. I was never going to find him. But shortly after having that dream, the universe seemed to conspire to help me find an answer. And a genealogy researcher got involved, and she was the one who uncovered his fate. And she also remarkably found Denise and Lily, his 2 surviving daughters. I got in touch with Denise, who was a woman of 78 years old. She had no recollection of ever seeing her father's letters before, or of having the letters read to her as a girl, though it's possible, if not likely. And I learned some of Marcel's grandchildren, who were in their late 50s. They knew he had been in Germany during the war, but they did not know where and they did not know why. They didn't know he had worked for Daimler, and they didn't know anything about his time in Germany other than what they learned from these letters. And between the font and the letters, they told me it was like I had brought him back to life. And for me, very selfishly, the most amazing thing about getting in touch with his family was to finally be able to see a photo of Marcel. So I would like to introduce you to Marcel and his wife, Reineke. So there's lots more to this story. Ultimately, more letters were found. I learned more about his time in Germany and about French forced labor. I learned more about his family and the village where they were during the war. There were lots of twists and turns in the search for answers, and all of that is in the book, Marcel's Letters, A Font and the Search for One Man's Fate. So that, thank you, and I would be happy to answer questions.
Do you know more about the vertical lines on the letters and why they were there?
I do. They are censor marks, actually. There's a pretty interesting, they're chemical censor marks. So they're looking for hidden messages in the letter. So the postcard has something like five different censor marks on it. So if you think about it, he had incredible intelligence as to the supply chain, or let's say he knew where a weakness on the tank was. He just had access to incredible intelligence, and so cards and letters from these laborers were highly censored. Yeah.
Okay, hang on. I see one question over here.
I do. The full trail of the letters is in the book. I've traced them back to Paris, although there is a gap in custody that I don't think we'll ever precisely know what happened, but I have traced them back to France.
And the remaining letters that I didn't purchase, they find their way back to France?
The letters that I didn't purchase?
Bought 5, and
Yep.
there were 19 in total.
Yep, there were 20 or so in the store. And the store went out of business shortly after I bought the letters. So I didn't have access to those letters. And I kicked myself. You would not believe how cruel I was to myself once I realized what was in the letters and having passed up the opportunity to buy more.
Okay, here we come. Let's see, I think this guy back here was next, and then Susan.
Did you get any kind of emotional response from the family upon seeing the font that you designed? What did they like? Was there people who recognized his writing enough, and then seeing your font was that? How was that for you?
So I went to France and brought my laptop, and they were able to watch my screen as I typed their names in the font based on Marcel's handwriting. And I mean, to be fair, they are very unfamiliar with the concept of font design. So I think it was surprising, not emotional as in they didn't start crying, but they did have opinions on specific letter forms, which they shared.
All right.
I just wanted to hear more about the font design and the process. You know, obviously the story is compelling. The story is compelling about the history and this man and your search, but I also want to hear some more about the type design and
Is there something specific you want to know about type design?
I don't know if I know enough about. I'm not a type designer. I do
Okay.
taken some calligraphy classes with Grendel, but so more about just the refining and how you chose to kind of smooth things or not, or how you the connector, the connecting passages between letters and how you worked on that.
So one thing I heard after I was done with this is that a connected cursive script font like this is the hardest kind of font to design, which I was completely oblivious to when I started the project. But if you look at the ERCI, the most challenging part is to ensure that any letter and any letter combination that they appear to in a very smooth and seamless way run from one letter to the next. And of course, now I know the trick how to make that happen easily, but I didn't know that trick then, which was part of the trial and error and error and error. But that, with a connected cursive script font, that is the biggest challenge.
And just to follow up, this is the first typeface that you designed.
Yes.
Sure. Okay, Calder?
In this entire process, did you ever talk to anyone who had experience designing fonts before, or was this just all on your own, looking things up on your own, or did you ever communicate with anyone?
The first 9 years, it was just on my own. I don't even know that there were a lot of YouTube videos at that point. I had one, so the user manual for FontLab, it was 900 pages long, 942 pages long, I think. And it was incredibly complicated, and there were times I was reading the user manual and I just didn't understand what they were saying. So I did my best, and sometimes I took the most inefficient rather, way of doing something, and that's what I did. I did know some people at the end, so there was a lot of coding involved to code all of the alternate characters. So there was one person that helped me with some particularly complicated lines of code. But by and large, I did most of the work just in a vacuum. I didn't know there were typography conferences.
Okay, one more.
So I actually have two questions. The
Yeah.
first is, what was the trick to connecting the letters?
Oh,
And the second one was, it looks like you still left a lot of imperfections in the letters.
yes.
But you did remove some, and I would be interested in knowing kind of how you chose where to keep those imperfections in and where you chose to smooth them out. What was your thought process behind that?
So when I first started outlining the original glyphs, I tried to be very truthful to the original handwriting for all these little nicks and curves. But ultimately, I discovered that FontLab would not support that level of detail. So some of what was stripped out was simply because the software didn't allow it. So then it was making judicious decisions about, okay, I can't have all of these little nicks, so which ones do I like? Which ones do I want to keep, and which ones can I get rid of? And the second, I'm sorry, remind me of what the second part of the question was?
What was the trick to connect?
Oh. So it was a trick that came, do you know who Laura Worthington is? No. So she is an amazing script font designer out of the Seattle area. And I took a workshop with her. She showed me the trick, and I believe she has a YouTube video on how that trick works. I think if I tried to explain it with my hands in the air like this, it wouldn't make any sense. So I would say Laura Worthington, YouTube video, it's her trick, she gets all the credit, and she can explain it.
Any other questions before we call it a night? Oh,
What ultimately happened to Marcel?
Well, that's my friend Dana, and I promise I didn't plant the question. If you don't want to read the book, and I understand, and I don't want to be one of those people that says you have to buy the book to get the answer, you can come up and get an envelope with the answer. So you don't have to read the book, but I am not going to tell you in case you want to read the whole journey and experience the discovery for yourself.
woo. Thank you, Carolyn.